Mr. Silliman has admonished me to keep the biographical details very concise and short. His bio is in our folder, our program, and we are, fortunately, he did not put in there, at least I don't see that he went to UVA Law School. I'm still trying to get over that, but I think what's very interesting about Mr. Silliman is that he is not only the general counsel, but he's the executive vice president of public policy. And just for our students here, it is an illustration of the different directions that your legal career can take you, because you learn skill sets when you go to law school that can be applicable in a wide range of areas. And Craig, maybe you'll tell me different, but did you ever think when you're in law school you would end up being executive vice president of public policy for a major telecommunications firm? And I think that it's, and the range of his responsibilities in this, in his current positions is truly remarkable. I won't go more than that. I do invite you to take a look at his bio. And I've asked him to talk about, we often talk within the military or within academia and so forth about these issues. He's going to give us a perspective from the business community, and really that is so important in a country which was built on the free enterprise system and capitalism and the ability to generate in a free society the kinds of jobs and so forth that we have in this country. Without further ado, Craig, thank you so much. And believe me, this guy is a busy guy.
Thank you, Charlie. Good morning. It's great to be here, and I thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation, Charlie. So as Charlie said, I'm Executive Vice President for Public Policy and General Counsel at Verizon. So in that role, I have the tremendous privilege to lead about 1,400 lawyers, regulatory specialists, lobbyists, and security professionals all around the world. So I am here today as the token representative of that strange and wondrous place called the private sector. So I am not going to get into a Talmudic dissertation on FISA. The panel that follows is far, far more qualified than I ever would be, and I have general in my title, so I have the ability to disclaim any specific knowledge of anything. But what I do have is the responsibility to sit in the middle of C-suite meetings, planning strategy, planning M&A, planning litigation, and deciding how we're going to position ourselves as a company and whether and how we are going to interface with the government in certain ways. So I assume most of you are familiar with Verizon, although you may not be familiar with all the things we do. So let me outline it quickly for you because it provides a little bit of context for the perspective from which I approach these issues. So most of you probably think of us first as a wireless company, which we are. Those of you from the Northeast may know that we provide broadband and video services between Virginia and Massachusetts. Third, we provide telematics, ad tech, and content services. Telematics basically involves connected vehicles with all the functionality that entails. Ad tech or advertising technology involves matching up digital advertising with digital platforms so that ideally when you're online, you see advertising that is relevant to you. If you don't, then it's still ad technology, it's just bad ad technology. So we picked up that business when we acquired AOL last year. When we acquired AOL, we also got into the content business with Huffington Post, MapQuest, TechCrunch, a couple other content properties. Then finally, we have a global business where we provide communication services to large enterprises and governments around the world. So if you're an Amex, a P&G, a Unilever, and you need to connect up your facilities in dozens of countries around the world across multiple continents, you're going to get those services from Verizon or a small handful of other global companies. In order to be in that business, you have to have a lot of infrastructure around the world, data centers, submarine fiber optic cables, terrestrial networks all over the world. It's worth pausing at that point for just a second because we all rely on and are surrounded by all this technology, but the basic infrastructure of it often is poorly understood. So I'm not going to get into the details of it here, but I do want to just make 3 quick points to ground us. First, if you're doing anything in the online environment, email, search, online banking, anything else, then you're communicating with a computer server somewhere. That computer server may be on the other side of the world, but you are communicating with a physical device over physical networks. That may seem like a self-evident point, but we often talk about the internet as if it's this ephemeral thing that connects up in the ether somewhere, but there's a very real physical infrastructure presence of this entire online environment. Second, that traffic almost certainly is traveling through wireline infrastructure. It's easy to think that because everything is moving to mobile devices, that wireline infrastructure has become obsolete. That's not the case, and in fact, the opposite is very much true. When you're on a mobile device of any kind, you're simply using that as an access medium into a wired infrastructure. The wireless signal may travel 10 feet, it may travel 1,000 feet, but it's traveling and dropping right into a wired infrastructure. So if you're texting with your friend in France, the signals aren't traveling through the air across the ocean. They're traveling a few feet, dropping into wired infrastructure and traveling across submarine optic cables. And that leads me to my third point, that almost everything that's happening in the digital environment between continents, and even when it's not between continents, is traveling across those fiber optic backbones. So with all that as background, you can probably see why we would end up interacting with law enforcement and national security entities all around the world. To give you a sense of scale, we process about 300,000 subpoenas, search warrants, court orders, and other legal processes every year. I have 200 individuals on my team who do nothing but handle interactions and processing legal processes with governments around the world. So with that as an intro, I'm here to provide the view of national security issues from the perspective of someone in the private sector. I expect that a few of my observations will be a little bit provocative. When I first wrote them, I anticipated it'd be 8:30 on Saturday morning, so I needed them to be provocative so that you'd actually be awake. As it is, I'll just make you choke on your turkey wrap. So I want to start with a few quotes. The first quote is from President Obama right after the Snowden leaks in June 2013. He said, referring to the PRISM program, "It does not apply to U.S. citizens and it does not apply to people living in the United States." It does not apply to U.S. citizens and it does not apply to people living in the United States. In response to this, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg somewhat sarcastically replied, "Oh, we only spy on non-Americans. Gee, thanks." Now, how you react to each of these quotes, or perhaps whether you relate to one or the other more, is relevant in the ongoing discussions and the tensions taking place between the private sector and the government in the tech and telecom sectors. One more quote. Referring to meetings last month at the White House on actually encryption issues, the White House spokesman said 3 times, quote, "Many of these technology companies that are participating in the meeting today are run by patriotic Americans." Patriotic Americans, close quote. Now, I think that was clearly meant as a straightforward compliment. But what I would like to explain to you today is why some in the tech industry might have seen that as unhelpful. I'm focused today on surveillance and national security issues, so I don't plan to really get into the discussion about Apple that has, if you were paying very, very close attention, you may have noticed was in the press this week. Although I will be taking questions at the end, and Charlie's already warned me we'll probably have to talk about that. But here's one thing I do want to mention, because there's a meta element to that whole debate that I think is very relevant here. The FBI asserts that Apple is taking the position it is for marketing reasons. So let's assume that's true. Regardless of what you think of the substance of that issue, it bears asking the question, how have we come to the point where opposing the U.S. government is an effective marketing strategy? Okay? So let's talk about why that would be the case. So I think it starts with the fact that citizens' relationship with and view of the government is changing. That's both feeding into and being reflected in the tensions between the U.S. government and the private sector and the U.S. and Europe. I believe that 5 developments together have shifted the discussion on national security between the U.S. and Europe. I focus specifically on the relationship between the US and Europe because first, these are two of the largest economic trading blocs on the planet. Two, they share a fairly similar set of values, mores, and legal traditions. Third, this is the relationship that's come under the greatest strain over the surveillance issues, and I think that's specifically because we share very common sets of principles and values. And so fourth, I think it is the most important relationship to fix and the one where it's most possible to do so. So the 5 developments I just referred to are the following. First, the evolution in trade and services and the modern multinational company. Second, the changing nature of communities of interest and identity, and specifically technology's role in that. Third, ways in which technology changes our concepts of jurisdiction and sovereignty. Fourth, public views of surveillance in the post-Snowden world. And fifth, how technology has changed national sovereignty over data and evidence. I'll touch on each one of these developments, and then I want to talk about a way forward. So let's start by talking about companies. So individuals and companies have traded across borders forever, but what's changed just in the past decade or two is the rise in the trade and services. It used to be that you manufactured goods in one country and exported them to others. That's still a key component of international trade, but the new component is providing services in multiple countries around the world. So if you think about it, there's a huge difference between making goods in one country and exporting them to another versus having local employees providing local services to local consumers in a country. There are now many, many examples of services that can be provided locally. Telecom, engineering, architecture, health services, legal services, computing, entertainment, and more, including, of course, these global platforms like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, AOL, etc. So with services being provided around the world like this, what does it mean for how one defines the nationality of a company? The nationality of its senior management, where its services are sold, where its employees are based, where it's domiciled for tax purposes. For a smaller manufacturing company, this is a fairly easy question because the answers to most of the questions are the same. A German company with a German factory and German management and German employees is very clearly a German company. But when it comes to multinational companies providing services, the issue seems to be increasingly defined by tax domicile. And this may even be true when goods are being sold. Recently, for example, there's been a lot of discussion and debate about tax inversion deals where a company moves its tax domicile from one country into another. Now, I don't want to get into the politics of tax inversion deals. National security is controversial enough, believe me. But as an illustration of the discussion about nationality, I actually think it's interesting. So the most recent company to come under scrutiny on this is Pfizer. So Pfizer was founded by a German who immigrated to the US in the 19th century. Its current CEO is Scottish. Most of its employees are located outside the US. Most of its sales and revenues are located outside the US. But it's currently considered a US company. As a result of a merger with an Irish company, it will cease to be a US company and become an Irish company. And this has been somewhat controversial. Again, I have no particular interest in Pfizer, and I don't want to get into tax policy here. My point is that we're increasingly defining companies based on tax domicile because it's hard to find another way to define the nationality of a company that has employees, operations, and sales and services in countries all over the world. So if the quote-unquote nationality of a company can change based on a transaction or a change in tax law without any change in where their goods are manufactured, their goods are sold, or their employees are located, I submit to you that it says something to us about the flexibility about the fundamental notion of nationality in the first place. Now, my guess is that a lot of you aren't buying this, right? It sounds like an excuse for companies just to move their corporate headquarters to lower tax jurisdictions. But I'd ask you to think about it this way. There was a time when our fundamental identity in this country was defined at the state, not the national level. And that was true for companies as well. But how relevant does that feel now? What do you feel the state identity is of Kellogg's, of Campbell's Soup, McDonald's, or General Electric? For that matter, it's already true for many global companies. Do you associate a particular national identity with Breyer's Ice Cream, Dannon Yogurt, Burger King, our wireless competitor Sprint? None of those is a U.S. company from a corporate ownership perspective. But as a consumer, it's irrelevant. Because here's the bottom line. The only way to operate globally is to both transcend national borders, but also to recognize local identity. Another way of saying that is you have to be a U.S. company in the U.S., a French company in France, a German company in Germany, a Brazilian company in Brazil, etc. That means you have to obey all the laws in that country in which you're operating, but you also need to be sensitive to the views, perceptions, and culture of your employees and your customers there. That does not mean that you do not recognize the virtues of the United States and all that it has as a company. But what it does mean is that you cannot be defined as being aligned with, for example, the US government in opposition to, for example, the German government. Right. The second development I want to discuss is communities of interest. For most of human history, our communities of interest were bounded by our geographic communities. Until relatively recently, most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. So you may not have had common views and interests with everyone in your town, but everyone with whom you shared common views of interest almost certainly was in your town. Even in the last hundreds of years or so, where transportation increased mobility, most of your community of interest was in your physical community. Television and radio were one-way broadcast, and there were only a few of them, so they broadcast and presented themselves to a broad audience. Mail was slow and telephone calls were expensive. So in theory, you could read or hear about only those issues that aligned with your views, but it was hard. And in theory, you could spend hours each day sharing your views with like-minded people in other parts of the country or the world, but chances are you didn't. In today's world, communities of interest can be completely disassociated from physical locations. You can find groups of similar interests and correspond online without regard to physical borders. There might be only 5 people on the planet that share the same interests with you, and they may be in 5 different continents, but you can connect relatively easily. Communications technology is ubiquitous, and for all intents and purposes, free. The entire online environment is interactive, so you can define the types of news and entertainment you receive based on your own personal interest. You may be part of the MoveOn.org crowd, or part of the Tea Party, or anything else. And you can get information that fits with your particular worldview and interact with others, and perhaps only others, who share those views. You can get your news from MSNBC or Fox News, Al Jazeera, or RT from Russia. Now, this has many benefits, but there's some downsides. I would say that you could argue it has cheapened our national political discourse, led to greater polarization, more echo chambers in terms of people's views, and less open views. Beyond the downsides, there are also dark sides. Yes, you can join a global discussion among those who are fascinated by African elephants, but you can also join ISIS. ISIS is, after all, by definition, a group aligned around a common ideology that wants to realign the world on ideological grounds rather than the traditional Westphalian nation-state concept of sovereignty. So you can live in Syria or Pakistan or the UK or the US and find your community not in physical proximity with you, but rather in the online community of ISIS. So technology now gives us the ability to disassociate our communities of interest from our physical locations, for better or for worse. Technology is also challenging our concepts of jurisdiction and sovereignty, which is the third development I want to touch on. Concepts of sovereignty have been malleable over time, of course, and have often been challenged by technological change. Quite a lot has been written about the invention of the printing press as the first real wave of information technology. Now, I'm not going to take a frolic detour through medieval history, although if it had been 8:30 on Saturday morning, it would have been a lot more fun before your caffeine kicked in. But I do want to actually note an interesting parallel to the point I just made about the internet leading to new communities of interest and ways to define those. At the risk of grossly oversimplifying a very complex era of history, it's not completely misplaced to draw connections from the invention of the printing press to the broad dissemination of the works of Martin Luther to then the creation of communities of interest that began to align around religious lines rather than the traditional feudal structure around the sovereign rulers, which in turn created tremendous tension and conflict. In fact, the religious wars that devastated Europe in the early to mid-17th century, over the 30 Years' Wars, were eventually brought to an end only by the treaties of Westphalia that really established a brand new concept of sovereignty in Europe around the concept of the nation state. Closer to home, a lot has been written about the fact that when this nation was created, there was a very weak sense of nationhood. As Benjamin Franklin referred to it as 13 clocks striking simultaneously, but not a strong conception of national identity. And in fact, 80 some odd years later, a bloody civil war was fought to keep the Union together. So 150 years ago, the balance of sovereign power in this country strongly favored state identity over federal identity. And most citizens' identities were based more strongly on state identity than national identity. Then in the late 19th century, we went through a process where at the federal level we passed the Interstate Commerce Act, formed the Interstate Commerce Commission, and there was a full generation of court cases basically defining the scope of federal power over interstate commerce and much more, ultimately leading to a federal government of a size, scope, and power far beyond anything that could have been envisioned in the mid-1800s. What caused this shift in focus? In large part, the railroads. It's easy to forget what a revolutionary technology the railroads were. They quite literally shaped the map of this country. There are few major cities in this country that were not on a railroad line, and several of them are only cities today because they were on railroad lines. The railroads changed how goods reached markets, and therefore, in turn, how people and where people could live and work. It opened up interstate commerce and mobility on unprecedented scale. But in turn, it exposed tensions because different states were imposing different and conflicting regulations on the railroads and, more importantly, on railroad-based commerce. This created the need for federal coordination and regulation of interstate commerce, and therefore drove debate about the balance of power between the federal government and the state governments. Another example of this is the creation of the FBI in the earliest 20th century. Before the automobile and the telephone, essentially all law enforcement was local. For the first time with the automobile and the telephone, you had the advent of cross-border crime, which drove the need for law enforcement coordination at a federal level. Now, these shifts were controversial at the time, and they created enormous tensions precisely because they usurped state authority and over commerce and law enforcement. Some would argue that some of that tension still exists to this day, but that's a whole different topic. But those shifts were necessary precisely because the technological advances broadened the geographic area across which law and commerce and policy needed to be harmonized. Global networks have now created the same dynamic on an international basis. Okay, let's turn to surveillance. The fourth development is the reality of the post-Snowden world. I was privileged to speak at this conference in the spring of 2012 on cybersecurity, and I remember acutely at the time having to be very careful about any discussion I entered into about metadata for fear that anything I said might give a hint towards what might be happening in the national security space. At the time, if you'd asked me about Pfizer, I would have said, I don't know what you're talking about, because we couldn't acknowledge receipt of a Pfizer order. That changed on June 5th, 2013. By the fall of 2013, we had trained our entire European sales force in how to talk about Pfizer because they got asked about it constantly. And this genie's not going back into the bottle. If anything, folks believe that the extent of surveillance is even more intrusive than it actually is. NSA will never again stand for no such agency. Going forward, the goal of the intel community must be brand management, not invisibility. And that means that companies as well must work on the assumption that any interaction we have with the intel community in any country in the world at some point will appear in the newspapers. That means that engagement must be done with an eye not only on legality, but also with public perception. Okay. Fifth and finally, technologies change national sovereignty over electronic evidence. Historically, our identities and most of our communications had a strong correlation to our physical location. People talked to their neighbors, they stored their letters and diaries and photos in their homes. Yes, letters were sent long distances, and yes, the telegraph and then the telephone allowed longer distance communications. But ubiquitous, cheap, long-distance communications weren't a reality really until the mid-90s. And until the mid-90s or so, communications platforms corresponded with nation-state borders. So for most of the past few hundred years, there's been an alignment on a geographic basis of government entities, communications and media platforms, and the physical location of stored data. In short, you, information about you, and your government all occupied the same physical space. The internet has changed that. Now almost all our data is stored in electronic form. More importantly, it's almost all stored on servers that may not even be in the same country we live in. From a technical perspective, there's certainly no reason that any of our data needs to be stored in the same location or even the same country or same continent that we are physically located in. And this is the crux of the issue in its most concrete form. On one hand, you have governments that are seeking evidence about individuals who are physically present in their country, but the data is stored outside of their country. On the other hand, you have governments who are fortunate enough to have lots of data stored in their territory that relates to individuals who aren't physically there. But that causes concern among those individuals about where their data may be stored and what their rights may be. So to put all this together, let's look at it from the perspective of a young German user of an internet platform that's built by a company headquartered in the US. You love the platform because you can communicate and form communities of interest based solely on people who have common interests to you, not based on where they're physically located. So yes, you identify yourself as German, but you also feel part of a larger context of values that's certainly spread across Europe and probably shared with the US as well. You have friends who also use the platform, and you have friends who work for the company that provides the platform. So you don't really think about it in national terms. You may even be savvy enough to know that your data could be stored in various places around the world, but you don't think much about it. But then you find out that the US government is collecting massive amounts of information that's stored in the US. And that makes you start paying attention in a slightly different way. But the US government says, we need to do this because we're fighting terrorism. And you're just about okay with that because you're not a terrorist and you share that goal. When you hear that the US government is tapping German Chancellor Angela Merkel's cell phone, and that doesn't seem to you to be directly related to terrorism. And then you hear the US government has rules in place to protect the rights of US citizens, but not you. And you hear these companies referred to as patriotic Americans, and suddenly you're looking at the world through a very different lens. First of all, you feel deeply betrayed. This isn't a trustworthy platform without boundaries that facilitates you communicating with people all over the world. No, it's an American platform that's being used by the US government to collect information about you, and you have no legal resource. So here we are. We have platforms that aren't defined by national borders, provided by companies that aren't defined by national borders, that enable communities of interest that aren't defined by national borders. Then in the context of combating terrorism, which isn't defined by national borders, you hear that the US government has come in and dropped a nation-state versus nation-state narrative framework on the whole thing. I hope you can see how this could be a problem for all involved. So now, where are we? We have countries all around the world who are both asserting extraterritorial jurisdiction while simultaneously passing laws to prevent companies from complying with extraterritorial demands from other countries. Unless things change, we're going to have a landscape littered with irreconcilable conflicts of law as far as the eye can see. So where do we go from here? One option is simply that the internet fragments. Countries will advance national champions, and data localization laws will force data to stay within national borders. There's no reason we can't have a US internet and a European internet and a Chinese internet and a Russian internet. Technically, that's certainly feasible, and to a large degree, it already exists in some places. A Chinese user doesn't see the same internet as a US user does. A Cuban user doesn't see the same internet a US user does. At current course and speed, there is inevitably going to be more fragmentation. But that'd be a tremendous loss, and no country would lose more than the United States in that scenario. A second option is that companies reestablish trust and credibility around the world by taking steps to protect data so that the US government can't get to it. You may have noticed that happening already. The Apple case obviously is an example of that, but it will be broader than that. For example, one US tech company recently announced that it's building a data center in Germany in partnership with Deutsche Telekom, structured in a way that the US company does not have access to the data. So it cannot access the data even if the US government serves an order on it. That type of structure is being discussed very broadly across many companies in the private sector in the United States, because US based companies may be forced to take such steps if they want to be able to continue to operate around the world. The US government has benefited from a significant amount of data being stored here in the US. So policymakers need to consider a world in which all that data moves elsewhere, because it's not entirely unthinkable. Neither of these options is good. A third option is to create a new legal process, as we've done in the past when technology has disrupted sovereignty and jurisdiction. In the ongoing controversy over surveillance, I think it's worth distinguishing between the question of whether government surveillance is acceptable at all versus the due process question of the conditions under which it's allowed and the rights that individuals have. While there's some hardcore advocates who would say that no government surveillance is acceptable, they're in the minority. Rather, much of the criticism about the US government surveillance data involves due process issues. It's not whether governments can get access to data, it's how they get data. We need to create a system that allows allies to work together to fight crime and terrorism while also recognizing the vital importance of privacy and the importance of individuals' rights to be able to be protected by their own laws. We need a system that takes into account the technological realities of the world we live in and is international in scope. We need new legal norms that are based on a person's nationality or location rather than the location of the person's data. For example, an American citizen or resident's rights should be determined by US law regardless of where his data resides. That allows government to get access to that data no matter where it's stored around the world, but also preserves the important rights for the individual. But by the same token, a non-US citizen who's located outside the US should have full protection under his country's laws with regard to his data that's stored in the US. Now, some would say this is absurd because the US doesn't owe any rights to a UK citizen who isn't physically in the US. But this objection is rooted in thinking about national sovereignty that seems immutable, but it's not. In fact, views on sovereignty and rights have been malleable throughout history, and in fact, throughout US history. When technologies created jurisdictional tensions in the past, we've come up with mechanisms that broadened the area of geographic commonality. Some also may say that we already have a mechanism for this, mutual legal assistance treaties, or MLATs. Well, yeah, in the sense that a Model T is a car, but not necessarily a car that's well-suited for our needs today. Now, such a system clearly would not be a global system at the outset. There are countries with which the US simply could not reach agreement in the foreseeable future. I'm not holding my breath for the US-North Korea data sharing agreement. But just because it couldn't be reached with every country doesn't mean it shouldn't be reached with any country. I would suggest there should probably be some sort of litmus test based around human rights standards in the countries with which we're negotiating. But certainly, if you look at the so-called Five Eyes countries, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia, along with the US, they would be obvious places to start because there's a strong basis of shared values, principles, and legal traditions. But there are also other countries with which we could reach agreement. Many of these are in Europe. And Europe is where so much of the friction is, so getting some treaties in place would be very, very significant. And there are great signs of hope in recent announcements that DOJ is negotiating an agreement along these lines with the UK. That's a great start, It's going to be politically controversial. We need to support it, and we need to see it as the first step of many. We live in extraordinary times where global communications platforms provide unprecedented opportunities. But the delinking of individuals' physical location from their communities of interest also is creating new challenges. I believe you see the symptoms everywhere. European independence movements in Spain, the UK, and elsewhere, tensions between the US and Europe over surveillance, companies feeling the need to oppose the US government to maintain credibility with their customers, ISIS, even our current political discourse. I believe we're in the midst of a historic shift in terms of citizens' views of their relationship to national governments. But I also believe that foresighted government policymakers in the intel community and elsewhere have the ability to stand back and in turn reframe how they view the relationship with that citizenry and move us past the current tensions into a world where we have the proper balance between law enforcement, necessary national security, and privacy. Thank you very much.
Mr. Silliman has very kindly agreed to take questions.
That doesn't mean I'll give answers. I just take questions.
Peter?
I know you work for the government. Hi, I'm Peter Margulies from Roger Williams Law School. Craig, I appreciate you coming and talking to us. My question is about the nature of the Europe-U.S. dialogue on surveillance. And there, I suggest, it seems to me there's sort of a disconnect, because on one hand, you have rhetoric in Europe which suggests privacy equals human dignity, and that's a very compelling concept for all of us. On the other hand, you have the actual practices of European nations. If you look at the UK, France, or Germany, they all engage in surveillance that in some ways is far more unchecked than our own. So how do we reconcile the difference between rhetoric and reality?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, we have lots of discussions about this. So what's really going on between the U.S. and Europe? And you say, well, very different conceptions of privacy. It's a fundamental human right versus something more amorphous. This is actually economic protectionism, masquerading as outrage over surveillance, right? There's lots of theories, and probably all of those are a little bit true. And there's the aspect, there's the famous Henry Kissinger quote of, I would call Europe if I had one number to call. There's a little misconception of when you talk about Europe on national security issues, you're not talking to the European Commission. You're really dealing with the member states. So when the Snowden stories broke, and Verizon was the first named company, if you may recall, 72 hours of my life that was more interesting in retrospect. At the time, it was a pretty intense time. When you get a call saying there's a FISA order that's about to be leaked, and first question is you don't know where it's been leaked from, and you're thinking, God, if this came from us, we've got a much larger problem, et cetera, et cetera. But as that settled down, and I began to go over to Europe, and I started this conversation saying, have you looked at RIPA? Do you understand the breadth? And I, in my role, end up dealing with a lot of the same types of entities in other countries around the world as they do in the U.S. So look at RIPA. Look what the French are doing. Look at the scope of activity that they are able to have. And it was interesting. The response, there's the old quip, I'm sure apocryphal, of the Vietnam general and the U.S. general who got together after the war, and the U.S. general said, you never beat us in a head-to-head battle. And the Vietnam general said, true, but irrelevant. Right? And that was sort of the response I got in Europe. I'd say, there are so many more legal protections in U.S. law around these issues. And they'd say, true, but irrelevant. And they would say two things. They'd say, one, the capabilities of the U.S. government, really they point to NSA, right? So the capabilities of the NSA so vastly exceed anything that European governments have that it's a material difference. The second thing they said was, all the data's in the U.S. So it's fine that we have greater legal powers, but the U.S. government has all the data, which is what's driving now the ECJ decision around evaluating a safe harbor, which if you read that decision as a legal matter, I can't make head nor tails of it in the sense that if this is true, you really can't, if you apply that legal reasoning, you really can't export data under any mechanism to any country in the world effectively. And I'm still waiting for the, the Max Schrems challenge to data flows to, say, India or Pakistan. But so clearly you see the political element, but it is driven by the fact that people say, yeah, these other countries may not protect data as well, or my own laws may provide much greater leeway to my national security agencies, but it doesn't matter because all the data's there. Now, the counter to that is, and those who work in this space know far better than I, there's a whole political element that goes on. One of the best examples of this was when an article popped in the press that said, NSA has 70 million French records. And President Hollande pounded on the table and called in the US ambassador and shouted at him. And, 8 days later in the errata section on, page A16 right at the bottom, it said, oh, that 70 million French records was 70 million records the French collected in Afghanistan and handed over to the US for analysis. But, there was a political element there, right? They were making political hay. And sort of like my observation about Apple, you do have to ask yourself, why do they see that as politically expedient? But when you talk to the actual member states who are dealing with this, as many of you know, there's a huge amount of cooperation. And we have been dragged through the mud in certain countries in Europe where there's been a very interesting dynamic where the national security establishment in various countries would say, listen, this is how it's going to happen. The politicians need to yell at you and beat up on you for a bit, but there's going to be an adult in the room, and we're only going to let it go so far because everyone understands that this has been fully coordinated and vetted, and there's a little bit of a kabuki dance aspect. So I think, I think there is an aspect of this that substantively you can pick apart and say there's hypocrisy. But I do think that if you look at what's driving it, which has to do with the large data flows and this sense to the large degree, I think, in Europe of betrayal, because they feel like, particularly in Germany, we're one of you, and now we find out you were a spy on us, and then you tell us we don't have any legal rights, which is why I go back to the due process point that says you tell a German citizen or a UK citizen, we're going to recognize you as full and equal rights. And it's why the Obama quote did get thrown back in our faces a lot in Europe. It said, okay, fine, you US citizens have rights, but what about the rest of us? And I think if we can establish a regime with those rights, we begin moving ourselves onto a better footing. And I think it's important because, look, there are plenty of fights to be fought with the Chinese and the Russians. If the US and Europe aren't together on this, it's going to be awfully hard to keep it from fragmenting.
If I could pose a question, actually two different questions. One is, as a private company, obviously a for-profit entity, to what extent do things like cyber defense and EMP defense and so forth, do you look at that as something that is really the responsibility of government to do, or is that something you owe your shareholders? And related to that, and when you talked about, the 72 hours after, Edward Snowden, give us a little bit of insight of maybe some lessons learned on crisis management from a large corporate perspective.
Sure. So so on your first question, we spend a lot of time thinking about cyber. There's no major company that doesn't, right? And your board of directors are asking about it. You have to get them comfortable with your plans and everything else. It's a major issue. And look, I spend a lot of time highly paranoid. I don't articulate it publicly that much, but in this room, you understand this. You say, look, there are a number of governments around the world who have entire agencies whose entire job, if you think about it, should be trying to get into networks like ours. So you don't have to be highly paranoid. You just say, hey, if they're not trying to get in, they're not doing their job, right? So you just kind of have to work from that assumption. Here's where, there is a fairly high degree of dissatisfaction right now in the private sector around cybersecurity issues for the following reason, because you have a lot of government agencies talking about it. And on one hand, you have agencies saying, we want to help you. We have another agency saying, share all your data with us. And you have other agencies that say, as soon as anything bad happens, we're going to come on down on you with an enforcement action like a ton of bricks. And there's just a fundamental tension there, right? It's the saying, hey, we want to help improve law enforcement policing in your community, but by the way, if a thief breaks into your house, we're going to fine you for it. It's a little hard to say share information about your breaches when you also say your sectoral regulators, they're going to turn around and bring an enforcement action against you when you do. That's point one. The other point is, clearly there are various shades of cybersecurity. You've got your kiddie script types, you've got your kind of mercenary criminals for hire, some of whom are very, very good. And then you've got your nation state stuff, right? And when you get into nation state, I would say, and I want to be careful a little bit of framing this too much in a national security framework, because I think you often have to look at cybersecurity more in a law enforcement, where a goal of having zero cybercrime is just not realistic without shutting the entire system down. But be that as it may, no one would expect to say, you run a factory that's important to the national economy, and you've got to harden that so much that if the Red Army comes rolling across the border with tanks, they can't break through the front gate, right? At some level, you can't expect companies, you can expect a basic level of competency and say, keep the criminals out. Keeping the PLA out is a level of sophistication that very few companies are going to have the scope and scale, much less the visibility into sort of the zero-day exploits and whatnot. And I think for that, we have to look at strong government partnership. I think we as a country have to look to the government to a certain degree to take responsibility for these big nation state to nation state. And look, let's recognize that this is a difficult issue because those attacks go two ways, and there are a lot of issues packed into that. Your second question on crisis management. Look, lots of people could talk about ways to handle this or not handle it. So just I won't bore you with all the details, but real quick chronology. I got a call around lunchtime on June 5th from the guy on my team who handles most national security issues saying, you need to come back to the office. There's something I got to talk to you about that we can't talk about over the cell phone. And but very rarely does that lead to sort of a happy conversation when I get back to the office. Very rarely say, hey, just want to let you know that case is resolved. It's all good, Craig. So I ended quickly, I went back, and he said, look, we just got a call from the Guardian, and they have a document, and they described it generally. And from the description, we had an idea of what it was, and there were about 6 people in the company that would ever have reason to see that. And they said, we're going to publish it tonight. So we happened to have a board meeting going on. So at the time I wasn't in this job, so I called up and said, okay, we've got to gear up. And this is tricky stuff, right? So now, as I said, we can't even acknowledge the existence of FISA order. And I've got a board that we've got to tell, okay, we're about to get some unwanted publicity on this thing. And then the other question that immediately goes to my mind is, okay, where did the Guardian get it, right? Because if it came from one of our folks, I've got a whole different problem on my hands besides a PR problem. Now, for reasons I won't go into, so then I went off to a dinner in Washington, one of these sort of typical Washington black tie dinners, but I happened to be sitting with a senator, a representative, an FTC chairman, 2 FCC chairmen, and 4 reporters. And I looked around and I thought, this is probably the very worst place on the entire planet for me to be right now. And so I excused myself halfway through the dinner. My press guy called and said, it's up. And I excused myself. One of the reporters turned and said, anything interesting that I should be writing about? And I sort of laughed and thought, oh boy, no, it's already been written about. So we quickly saw that this thing, based on markings, we very quickly identified this didn't come from us. So I kind of took one thing off the scene, although some of our friends in the government swore up and down there was no way this could have ever leaked from the government. It surely must have come from us, and so there was a little bit of tension there. Now the question is how you talk about it. This was an exceedingly odd situation. The Guardian has just published a FISA order with our name on it that all of 6 billion people on the planet can see, and yet I can't acknowledge that we've ever received a FISA order. So we're in very weird legal territory. And so the first thing we did said, look, everyone's gonna be talking about this, we have to have a statement out. And so we wrote a statement. At this point, this is, I'm sitting in my tuxedo in my office about 1 a.m. with our press guy, which was absolutely the worst time I've ever had at 1 a.m. in a tuxedo, let me just say. In drafting this statement, what we decided to do is put out something to all employees, and it says, privacy is very important to us. Having said that, we receive government orders. If we were to receive such an order, we would have to comply with it, right? So everything was in subjunctive and conditional tense, but it effectively said what we said, which is, look, if we were compelled to do something, we were compelled to do something. So that got out there, and then, of course, that was an internal statement, but it quickly got out to the press. And we got on a call very early the next morning with folks in the White House and NSA to kind of talk through how they were going to handle it, because we really felt, from there, our press strategy was three things. One is, we don't stand up and defend the government on this. The government has to speak for itself, right? Second is, all the language around compelled, required, right? This has to be, the narrative we knew was going to be, real close buddy-buddy government industry. We've got to say, legal process, we comply. Whatever the rationale from a policy perspective of doing these things, let the government explain that. And then the third thing is, calls were coming in from the press, because it was a little hard to understand. There was this corporate entity that was named on it that people had trouble making sense of. And so all the reporters were saying, well, what does this entity do? Why this entity? What does this mean? What do you guys do? What do you turn over? It was all kind of, the question was diving deeper on Verizon. So I said to our press guys, here's the narrative. If this is true, then who else would also receive these? As long as our name's in the news, it's a bad place. This has got to be about something broader. And then later that day, the news broke about PRISM. And
Could you tell folks just a little bit what PRISM is?
yeah, so PRISM is the 702 program that, in this case, was reported applying to the internet companies, Google, Yahoo, Facebook. And, so our whole strategy was sort of get ourselves out of the press. And it was interesting because what those guys did was immediately come out. The article said, government has direct access into their databases. And they came out and said, not true, they don't have direct access. Well, then that drove a whole second day cycle of stories about, well, what did they mean? That was a very carefully worded thing. What is not direct access versus? So at that point, there was about a 72-hour cycle where all the stories were about parsing what the Silicon Valley companies had said, and we sort of disappeared from the story. And then by Sunday, that was kind of Wednesday through Saturday. Sunday, Snowden came out in Hong Kong, and then the narrative went about them. And largely, that was kind of it. So our whole sort of crisis management was, how do you say something that tells your employees how to talk about this and how to think about it, how your board to think about it, without violating legal obligations in terms of classified programs? How do you quickly reframe the narrative to be about something besides the company? Because basically, if you're explaining, you're losing. That's not where you want to be. And that was our strategy, sort of forged in the wee hours. Whether it's successful or not, I'll let others to judge, but I think we did it probably as well as we could out of a fairly unique time.
Well, since you did bring up Silicon Valley, and I think there's a company called Apple out there, understanding it's not your problem today, yes. I don't think. And here we have Bill Gates coming out, kind of contrary to Apple, but I think that, can you perhaps put the issue in the framework you talked about earlier? Apple's a multinational company. There's lots in the New York Times these days that they're taking this position because of branding. And some people, but at the same time, we have the owner of the device that wants it open, and we have a federal court order. So the other side of it, and we have a terrorism case. The other side of it is the rule of law. Is anybody too big to be above the law, et cetera? Yeah. Just some general thoughts.
So, general thought, and we're generally staying out of this, and we're trying to stay out of it, but it's kind of hard to, and we've talked about amicus briefs and things like that. So first, as I said earlier, I do think it's an interesting question, right? I think Apple clearly sees this as very, very important to their brand image. And I think that bears some reflection. There's an interesting question of why that would be. Now, Bob Lick could say much more than I can. Well, he can't say anything at all, but if he could actually explain this better than I suspect, this feels to me like the FBI picked the perfect case, right? You have a dead terrorist. It's not even his device. It's his employer's device. They've given permission. They've already turned over everything that was backed up in iCloud. So you're talking about just the stuff on the device for the past 44 days. And more to the point, and this is what I think is interesting, the narrative is this is about backdoors to encryption, right? But of course it's not. It's about disabling a function that destroys the data on the device. And the way I've explained this to people sort of in an analog world, say, how would you feel about a company that makes safes that if you try the device, if you try the combination more than 10 times, it incinerates all the contents of the safe? Would you feel like the safe maker has to disable that functionality for the government if they're investigating a crime? Now, reasonable minds can disagree on that, but I think more people in that case would say, I don't think we should let you destroy, the device. If you have the capability to destroy the evidence and you can disable that, that feels different. But I think it's by being framed as backdoors to encryption, it changes the debate. And I will say not clean hands on this. We talked a lot about how we might want to weigh in because a lot of people are asking our opinion. And so we put out a statement that said, we're for strong encryption and no backdoors, because that's what everyone's talking about. And that was a way to say, not weighing in on Apple at all, but let me just state this. Now, we're actually, just wrote last night a LinkedIn post that will go up from our CEO where we flesh that out a little bit more and say, look, there are times when the functionality to destroy data should probably be disabled. Here's what my personal view is. This should be dealt with by Congress. All Writs Act is the wrong vehicle for this. It does worry me in my role about how broadly All Writs Act can be read. The telecom industry has a history here back in the 70s. As many of you know, the All Writs Act was used to originally compel carriers to put wiretap and trap and trace devices in our networks. That was ultimately superseded by CALEA, which was a statutory basis for that. I think Randall Stevenson at AT&T, the CEO of AT&T, made an interesting comment. He said, you know what, I'm sympathetic to Tim Cook, but this isn't his decision to make. And I think that's actually not a bad way to articulate it, that this ultimately is a societal decision, and you make societal decisions through Congress. So ultimately, I think this one has a lot of interesting components. It has, why do you do this, and what does it say about the larger zeitgeist out there about law enforcement, about surveillance, about people's feelings about privacy, how much we all put on our devices, which is essentially our entire lives, right? It's everything that you used to keep in your home is on the device, and there's a real sensitivity there, and I think we need to take that very seriously. It's about the way that cases like this, when they become high profile, become an empty vessel into which people pour lots and lots of issues beyond what the narrow legal issue may be. I think it's an issue about, do you do something through a court order or a larger congressional process that weighs the larger societal interest? And I think, at least if it were me, if this were my company and I were advising our CEO, I would think optically about it. And again, I'm not commenting on Apple, what they should or shouldn't do or what they have done, but I would say, am I going to ultimately do this in any country in the world? In particular, if I were faced with the choice that I couldn't sell my devices in China unless I provided this functionality, would I be willing to give up my largest market in the world? If the answer is no, then I would think about the optics of standing up on this particular issue against the US if I thought I might cave down the road to a country where the optics became less favorable for me. I think I would rather take that early. But I think pushing it to Congress is exactly the right way to go. And I'm talking to some Hill folks the other day. They feel like this has become such a high profile, they're going to have to deal with it, which I think is not a bad thing.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Is it on? Yes. My name is Beth Berman, and I live here in Durham. And my question is, why do you think that people in this country seem to get so much more upset about this alleged invasion of privacy, of their privacy by NSA, who's collecting, long strings of numbers or whatever, and isn't interested in our conversations, then about all the sale of our data to private companies who are trying to manipulate us and get us to buy products and so on. Thank you.
Wow, that was a wow. What I love. Bob Litt is just smirking. So, a couple of comments. And there's lots of discussion about this, about sort of different cultural contexts, that folks in the U.S. trust companies more and government less. In Europe, it's somewhat different. That can be overplayed and oversimplified in some ways, although I do think there are some aspects of that. We did a lot of polling in different countries around the world in the sort of right after the Snowden leaks, kind of a couple months after that. And it's interesting. Look, if you bring up these issues in the UK, the association is Bletchley Park, Enigma machine, World War II, very positive. This is an essential part of government function in protecting the country. You bring it up here, and you get Nixon, you get J. Edgar Hoover, you get Church Commission, right? And then very famously, people talk about it in Germany. You get Stasi, right? So I think that you can be overly glib on that, on the cultural resonance of these issues, but I don't think it's also completely without merit. I do think that we have historical context in different countries and different cultures about the role of government and whether it is turned internally versus externally, and whether it is a net positive. I do think, by the way, that the goal, I said before, I think the goal of the intel community, by necessity, must be brand management, not invisibility. I think the UK is the goal there, right? Being seen in that Bletchley Park, sort of Alan Turing, there's got all this kind of great tweety, old positive associations. That's a very important part. It's interesting, and you can do all sorts of dissection on how different companies have reacted to this, because it hits a little close to the nerve, right? If people start focusing on, gee, who else has the data? But I think ultimately there is an interesting aspect that says, whom do people trust most with their data? And that's the why, again, to the point I made in my comments, it's driving a narrative on these issues where companies feel a need to show that they're fighting very visibly for their customers' privacy, because if that's lost, it becomes a very dangerous narrative. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't make one point. The internet's a pretty amazing thing, and we get to consume content for free all day long, all these blog posts, all this video, all these things we all watch, which is all based on advertising, right? Just like old broadcast TV. So I would say there's a value exchange there, that we are using our data for advertising. We as citizens, we as consumers, our data is being used for advertising, which is then being used to fund all this amazing content. So I would say it's not just this kind of rapacious companies sucking all this data and just taking advantage of people. What they're doing is, look, you never had to write a check to Google, right? And there is a value exchange there. But having transparency and visibility into that value exchange, I think, is quite important. But I think it comes down to the trust, which is why companies are so focused on their perceptions of being trustworthy and fighting for their company's privacy, their consumers' privacy.
I by no means am saying what the FBI is going to do or can do or will do or whatnot, but if it were me, I would sooner, as the owner of a company and its product and its software and its hardware, have the control of that backdoor in my hands and my company's hands and my tech's hands than in the government's hands, who, from my experience in the military, have been known to ask the lowest bidder to come up with an answer to their question. Jimmy Johnny in mommy's basement or garage could come up with the same thing, and he may want a new Xbox One and sell that technology to the highest bidder. So what would you say, in your opinion, is driving Apple to fight this, with that being the potential, as opposed to having further control over the backdoor?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for Apple on this, but I definitely agree with you. Look, my personal view is, to the degree that there is a capability to disable software functionality in any device, that should not be held by the government. That should be held by the company itself, and it should only be accessed or be used under very delimited situations, clearly articulated in law. And with the appropriate approvals, we may decide certain types of capabilities are only used. You don't necessarily want something to be handed to every prosecutor in the country to investigate every 2-bit crime. You may want to roll out something that says this will only be authorized by the deputy AG or some such. But I think having that software in the hands of the company and not having it turned over to the government is very, very important in terms of credibility, both for the companies and for the government on this issue.
I think we have time for just one more question. Who I ask? Oh, I'll ask myself. We have a lot of young law students. We have some military lawyers here who may go on to do other things. Thinking back on your career, what advice might you have for law students and young lawyers to be who might aspire to be Craig Silliman someday?
Wow. Incriminating pictures of senior managers. No. So let me say, caution. So let me say a couple things. First, cautionary note, there's always the confirmation bias danger that you say, okay, you ended up in this position, therefore everything you did was the things that will lead someone to get into that position. And that's not necessarily true. There may be many, many paths there. So I would say, forgive me generally because most of you have no interest in hearing my career advice, but since Charlie asked, I'd say a couple things. First, what I always tell people when they ask this, know thyself, right? Know who you are, know what your strengths are. We're all different. Are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? Do you like working in teams? Are you a self-starter? No matter what you do, you're not going to be good at it, or at the very least, you're not going to be happy at it if it completely contradicts your personality, right? If you like only working with teams, don't go into a legal career that has you only in kind of self-starting type roles. The second thing I would say is, and this goes to know yourself, one of the things, if you want to do a generalist type of role like this, you've got to be comfortable moving outside your comfort zone. I've changed jobs every 2 to 3 years, and we as lawyers are trained to become deep experts in one particular field. A $130 billion company with operations all over the world spanning great things. As a general counsel, you can't become the expert in everything. What you have to be able to do is spot issues across IP and employment law, national security, policy issues, M&A transactions, corporate governance. And to do that, I spent 15 years doing nothing but more than that, but the last 6 years of my career was basically me moving through various positions as deputy GC positions to touch all the different parts of the legal department. That's a fascinating thing if you're comfortable constantly getting into new areas, but for many of us, particularly if you're trained to be valued on your expertise and your advice, that can be quite terrifying. So again, my answer would be, if you want to do that, you need to be comfortable moving through all that. But if you're not, that's okay. Think about what you aspire to do. Don't aspire to do that just because you're chasing a title. If you do, you may get the title, but you're not going to be happy. The third thing I would say is read the rapids. And here's what I mean by this. For those of you who've ever been whitewater rafting, how you ride through rapids, it almost entirely depends on where you enter them. Once you're in them, the currents are so strong that you can paddle as hard as you want. You're never going to get out of them. Look, I could have been the best lawyer in the world if I'd gone into video store legal issues in 1990. I probably wouldn't be the GC of Blockbuster because the industry's gone, right? You have to, you have to kind of read what's out there. You can see what, at a macro level, what are the technologies, what are the trends, what are the areas that are growing, because those are going to create more opportunities, even within a company, right? If you're working for someone, you may be better at that job than they are, but if they're not going to retire for 20 years, guess what? You're not getting their job, right? Understand what the pathways are through the company and be willing to move around, create those pathways, look at where the water's going from a personnel perspective, from a corporate political perspective, and from a larger sort of demographic ecosystem, technology, business trends perspective, and find the fast currents. Now, you got to do all the things right once you're in the current, but you can do a lot of things right if you're paddling against the current. You'll never get there. So take a broad view about the demographic trends. If you're a student and you're 25, don't play to what's the big hot thing now. There are plenty of futurists out there writing about what the trends are going to be over the next 20 to 30 years. Read about those and get in early and ride the wave.
Craig, thank you so much. You know, quite seriously, this is one reason why we do this conference, because to have the opportunity to hear from you, not only the early part of your lecture, but the last 5 minutes, I think, was really, that would alone have been worth the price of admission. Now for the ROE, we will reconvene at 12:45 sharp. So please be back in.